Hey, good morning. It's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Today I want to talk to you about roses, own root roses versus grafted roses. Which one is better? And this is not a brand new debate. In fact, it's been around so long, I found a book. This is Hennessy on Roses, published 1942, and he outlines almost all the same points I'll be talking about today. And what is that, about 75 years ago? So it's incredible that we've been talking on this topic for so long, but we haven't come to a full resolution. And I guess that would indicate that there's points on both sides, and I'll talk about that here. You might expect me to be a bit biased because I'm a producer of own root roses, but I can think of at least a couple situations where grafted roses are just better. But before I go into advantages and disadvantages here, for some of you, you might not know what the heck I'm talking about. What does it mean to talk about something being grafted versus own root? Okay, so roses in nature, as they're grown from seeds or seedlings, will first thing they do, the very first thing in life, is they send down their own root, and it's genetically identical to the package inside that seed. So the top stalk, the top growth, is exactly genetically identical to the roots. Makes sense, right? Also, when I take a cutting in my greenhouse, the very first thing it wants to do is start sending out its own roots. So I've taken the cutting of genetic material from the top, and it grows genetically identical material on the bottom. But that production system can take a little bit of time. So if I take a cutting, it might be 6 months to a year before I can pot that up to a gallon pot, and it might be 2 or 3 years before it would grow into anything near this size here. Now this actually is a grafted rose, and the production system on that is a little bit different. So they grow one rose, usually from seed, sometimes from cuttings. They grow it in the field, and they grow it up to a size. So they might take 2 or 3 years making it a big, beautiful rose in the field. Then the next thing they do is, through a process called grafting, they'll take a scion from the own root rose. They'll take a scion, there's just a little piece of tissue from around the bud, and they'll graft it or chip it onto the stalk of the rootstock variety. And then it will grow, and they'll chop off the head of the original rootstock variety. So what you're left with is a rootstock that belongs to a rootstock variety, and the top stalk belongs to the scion variety. So it's a hybrid. It's like a Frankenstein plant. I don't mean that in the GMO kind of way. I just mean that in the classic, take one part of the body and graft it onto another. So what you can see on this one here, and maybe I'll get you a close-up, is you can see this prominent spot on the rose called the graft union, underneath of which all of the tissue belongs to one rose, and above that point all of the tissue belongs to another rose. And by contrast, this rose here, which I took from cuttings, and I'll get you a close-up on that as well, you can clearly see there's no big bulge like that under which all the tissue belongs to the other. It's actually all genetically one rose. The roots belong to the plant. Okay, time to start talking about the advantages and disadvantages. And again, in that book, you can see the list that he makes of the claimed advantages versus disadvantages of grafted roses. So I'll talk about those here, and maybe the first one that he mentions, and the first one that most people will talk about, is how quickly you can get a really beautiful rose from the grafted process. So the producer puts the time into making this big, beautiful understock or rootstock. They graft on the rose, and a year or so later, they're able to ship that to you with canes on it that are ready to bloom, and you'll get big blooms that first year. Whereas with an own root rose, it can take some time to get there. Now, I'm not an instant gratification kind of guy, so that doesn't bother me. But you should note that initially, is that if you buy something grafted, in many cases you will get much, much faster results than you will get growing it own root. The exceptions on that have grown over time. So what he wrote, again, 75 years ago, didn't take into account that some breeding has happened between then and now, which has produced roses that perform a lot better on their own roots. In fact, I would say back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, they barely even evaluated roses for how they would perform on their own roots, because they knew that they would be grafting them. So there wasn't that evaluation that went into the own root roses, so we didn't know. Now, many breeders do evaluate almost first and foremost for health and vigor of a rose on its own roots, and so there are a lot more contenders that way. So going right along the list that Hennessy made in this book, his second advantage of grafted roses actually is a disadvantage in disguise. He talks about the longevity of a good, well-kept grafted rose being a dozen years or so. And for me, that's like, well, I've seen own root roses that last decades in the garden. If you go back to Europe, you'll find some on castle and monastery walls that number their years in the hundreds of years. So it's not bad that they live for about a dozen years or a little bit more on their own graft, but it's not impressive to me in any major way. The third advantage listed in this book is actually a stronger point, I think. It's that the grafted varieties growing on a rootstock may be more adaptable to different soil conditions. I guess the point is that if you had a scion variety that grows a weak root system or not a very adaptable root system, and you put it onto the roots of a stronger variety with a more adaptable root system, you can put that into any soil and the genetic weakness of the scion won't matter, right? So if you take a multiflora rootstock that's going to do well in a heavy or clay soil, and you take that, you can put any variety grafted onto that is going to do equally well in that same soil. So it makes for a more adaptable rose. And I'm going to say fair enough on that. Although, I have a pretty heavy clay soil here. I do own root roses, and I don't have problems establishing them in this soil. I guess I'm going to say your mileage may vary on that point. I don't believe in it so strongly, but I do take the point that many of the own root roses were never evaluated for the strength of their own roots, and so some of them will struggle in some soils. Now onto the disadvantages of grafted roses, and I guess conversely you'd say that each of these disadvantages of a grafted rose is an advantage of the own root rose. And the first point is that graft union, that place where they've grafted the top stalk to the rootstock, is the weakest part of the rose, insofar as it does tend to build up scar tissue. Whenever a cane dies back down to there, you get this woody, dead-looking stump on there. That's where disease can get in. It becomes the weakest and most vulnerable part of your rose, and oftentimes people will bury that graft union under the surface of the soil, so you can't even tell what's going on there. At least I keep mine usually up near the surface so I can clean it up and keep a track of how well it's doing. But yeah, it's the weakest part of the rose, and when they talk about that 12-year lifespan of a grafted rose, that's usually what does it in, is that some portion of those canes die back to the graft union, and then the rose is dead. Whereas with own root roses, I often find them shooting up brand new shoots from below the soil surface and renewing themselves that way. He makes an interesting point in the book here. He calls it point number 3, which is that the strength of the grafted section of the rose enables or allows weaker varieties to be grafted on, and thus disguises some of their weakness. So if you have a really, really strong rootstock, then you put something on it like, say Distant Drums or Double Delight or something like that, then it grows extremely well and shows up as a great plant in the garden. But when people take their own cuttings off of it and try to root those, they're not going to get great results. True enough, that's my point about these the grafted system, is that it wasn't made for the advantage of the gardener, although it may have some advantages to the gardener. It really was made for the convenience and marketing ability and the ability of nurseries to pump out large volumes of brand new varieties in a very short period of time without much scion material to go on. So when they found a new variety that they knew would be a marketing success, they didn't want to wait 3 or 5 years for own root roses, for evaluation of own root roses, and then to try to build that stock up to size. All they had to do was chip off little bits of buds and just slam them onto thousands of rootstock varieties that were already in the field, and they could get that to market the very next year. So he's 100% right there. I think it probably did hide a lot of the genetic weaknesses of rose varieties throughout all the years that roses have been grafted. Now he does list some advantages of own root roses, and I'm only going to go over the first one because I think it's the only important one on the list, which is that if grown on their own roots and established well and grown to size, that own root roses can be vigorous, healthy, high-performing plants that last a really, really long time in your garden. And that's it for me. That's what I want in a rose. I don't want to go for lots of blooms really, really quickly, as they put in the advertising brochures. It doesn't take years to make a great rose. It only takes weeks or something along those lines. And I get it. You know, instant gratification is the thing. But for me, the thing that appeals to me more is getting a rose in the ground that's going to have longevity and performance. But I haven't talked about the elephant in the room yet. And that is that graft, the top stalk is above it, the rootstock is below it. The rootstock doesn't always stay where it belongs. The rootstock sometimes sends out rootstock suckers. And that's annoying to the maximum. So I have a good supplier I buy roses from, Palatine Roses, and I'm not gonna badmouth them at all. I just made another order. They're fantastic, and they actually offer a lot of rose varieties that other suppliers don't offer. So really happy with them as a supplier, but they graft the roses. Okay, no problem there. But probably 1 out of 4 of the roses that I buy from them, within a year of putting them in the ground, they shoot from below the graft. They shoot a new rootstock sucker. And if you're not quick and you don't catch that and you don't see, oh, there's something weird going on there with my rose, that rootstock section is very vigorous. It can dominate the performance of your rose. So suddenly you're not getting these wonderful flowers that you bargained for. You're getting some long blind piece of wood, or you're getting something with insignificant flowers on it, and it's annoying to the max. I'm gonna see if I can find something like that in the garden here so I can show you what it kind of looks like. But yeah, that's for me the deal breaker about buying grafted roses, is if I can choose own root, I choose own root, because I don't want those rootstock suckers in my garden. All right, I've gotten up close and personal with a rootstock sucker here. This one is on the variety Complicata, which is established along the back fence of my property. The crown is actually way back there. And up front here is a rootstock sucker that looks a little different. And what I want to do is I want to get some footage that demonstrates them side by side with the main stems of the plant. But I'm going to go up here and show you that one of the main differences is the foliage. So if you count the leaflets on the rootstock sucker, that has 7 leaflets on it. The main plant has, and the leaflets are kind of silvery or grayish in color. I hope you can pick that up on the film. Whereas the main stems of Complicata are a warmer, greener color and usually have 5 leaflets. Also, Complicata, when it blooms, it has obviously the flowers, you could tell very easily at that point, but even at this stage of the year, when you look at the hips, they are large, round, orange hips. Whereas if you ever see the rootstock in this case go to hips, you'll see urn-shaped, smaller hips, almost like a dog rose. So I don't want to unfairly malign Palatine Roses, because I don't think I got this one from them. I think this is back in the day when I was able to order roses from Hortico. But similarly, when I plant any grafted rose, there's a risk that I get this rootstock sucker. And the only way for me to get rid of it is to go back down to that base there and cut it, if I can, even below the soil level. Get it as far back towards the crown as I can to eliminate some of that tissue. But it's an ongoing battle. This one I've been fighting with for over 10 years, and still every year I have suckers like this one pop up, threatening to take over the whole shrub. Alright, thanks so much for watching this video on the difference between own root and grafted roses. I'm quite sure that in this discussion I've missed some important point about this. So if you're a rose expert, or even if you're not, and you have some questions about this, drop comments below. We'll sort through those questions together. Thanks so much for watching.